The rain falling on the grand courtyard of Gyeongbokgung Palace did not feel like water. It felt like icy needles piercing through the thin, soaking wet fabric of my white mourning hanbok. The rough, uneven cobblestones dug violently into my bare knees, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow, rotting void in my chest. Before me stood Chief Eunuch Song, a man who had once bowed so low to my father that his forehead touched the floor. Now he stood straight, holding a lacquered wooden tray covered by a yellow silk cloth. On it rested a single, flawless celadon bowl. Inside was the sanyak, the royal poison granted only to high-ranking nobles as a merciful execution. By the supreme mandate of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Lee Yeon, Eunuch Song read from a heavy golden scroll. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion, cutting through the sound of the torrential downpour. Consort Park Seo-yoon of the noble Park clan of Hanyang is found guilty of high treason, embezzlement of military funds, and the practice of dark witchcraft against the royal noble consort Cho. The sentence is immediate execution. I didn't cry. I had shed my final tear 3 days ago when the bloodied armor of my father and older brother was thrown at my feet in the palace dungeons. My family, the revered Park clan, smeared as traitors and slaughtered like stray dogs in the street. I slowly lifted my chin, the freezing rain pasting my unpinned hair to my cheeks. I looked past the eunuch, up the towering flight of granite steps that led to the majestic Gunjeongjeon, the imperial throne hall. The vibrant danchong patterns painted under the grand eaves seemed to mock me with their bright reds and greens. And there he stood, Emperor Lee Yeon, the man I had pledged my life to when I was just 16, the man who had held my face in his hands and sworn that we would rule Joseon together, the man whose very throne was paid for by my family's vast wealth and secured by my father's northern garrison armies. He stood under a massive silk umbrella held by his guards, wearing the royal dragon robes of deep twilight blue. His expression was completely blank. He looked at me not as a partner, not as a lover, but as a nuisance he had finally managed to sweep out of his courtyard. Beside him, clinging to his arm and hiding her face behind an intricately painted silk fan, was Consort Cho. She wore a brilliant crimson dangwee jacket with pure gold embroidery, the very garments I was supposed to wear for the upcoming spring festival. Even through the heavy rain, I could see the edges of her eyes crinkling. She was smiling. It all made sense now. The misplaced ledgers, the cursed talismans planted in my chambers, the forged letters with my father's seal. It wasn't just Cho's jealousy, it was Lee Yeon's greed. He had drained my family's wealth, used our military might to secure his crown, and now that we were too powerful, he was exterminating us for his own personal gains and to elevate his true love. Eunuch Song stepped forward, lowering the tray to my level. "Drink, Consort Park. Do not make this harder than it must be." My hands were trembling, completely numb from the cold, as I reached out and took the heavy celadon bowl. The dark, thick liquid inside smelled sickeningly sweet, like bitter almonds and rotting fruit. I looked up one last time. I locked eyes with the Emperor. I didn't beg. I didn't scream my innocence. The naive, foolish girl who believed in the Emperor's love died the moment she saw her father's bloodied armor. "Lee Yeon," I whispered. My voice was raspy, broken from days of screaming in the dungeon, yet it somehow carried over the storm. "If there's a next life, if the heavens granted me another chance," I vowed, my eyes burning with a hatred so deep it felt like it could shatter the stone beneath me. "I will not be a flower in your inner court. I will be the fire that burns your empire to the ground. I will take everything you love, and I will watch you choke on the ashes." Without breaking eye contact, I brought the bowl to my lips and drank. It didn't go down smooth. It felt like swallowing molten iron mixed with crushed glass. The agony was instantaneous and absolute. I collapsed onto the wet cobblestones, the bowl shattering next to my head. My insides felt as if they were dissolving. Blood pooled in my mouth, hot and metallic, spilling over my lips to stain my white hanbok. My vision blurred. The towering eaves of the throne hall spun violently. The last thing I saw before the suffocating darkness pulled me under was the Emperor. He turned his back on me and walked inside. I shot upward, my hands violently clawing at my own throat. I was choking, gagging, expecting the metallic taste of blood and the blinding agony of the Sanyak. But there was only the clean, crisp scent of burning sandalwood and dried pine. I was gasping for air, my chest heaving. I wasn't cold, I wasn't wet. Beneath me was the familiar, comforting warmth of an ondal floor radiating through thick sleeping mats. I frantically touched my face, my neck, my stomach. No blood, no pain. Your Highness, are you having a night terror?" I snapped my head to the side. Kneeling beside my bed, holding a small brass lamp, was Court Lady Choi. Her face was young, unblemished, and etched with deep concern. I stared at her, my mind fracturing. Court Lady Choi had been dragged out of my chambers and beaten to death by the royal tribunal's guards a week before my execution. I had watched them break her bones because she refused to sign a false confession against me. Yet here she was, her eyes wide with worry. "Choi," I croaked, my voice sounding incredibly soft, lacking the raw, torn rasp of a prisoner. "I am here, my lady. Shall I fetch the royal physician? You are pale as a ghost." She reached out to dab my forehead with a warm cloth. I grabbed her wrist with a grip so tight she winced. "What year is it?" I demanded, my eyes wide, wild, and desperate. "Tell me the exact year and the month, now." She looked terrified, but answered quickly. It is the 3rd year of His Majesty's reign, my lady, the month of the tiger. We are preparing for the Spring Lantern Festival next week." The 3rd year. The month of the tiger. I let go of her wrist and fell back against the silk pillows, staring blankly at the exposed wooden beams of the ceiling. I had returned. I was sitting in my own chambers at Gyeongbokgung Palace, exactly 3 full years before my execution. 3 years before my father was framed. 3 years before the Emperor stole my family's wealth. Consort Cho was not yet the Emperor's favorite. She was still just a newly appointed sukwi, a lower-ranking concubine. My father was still alive, commanding the impenetrable northern garrison. My brother was still breathing. I slowly pushed the blankets off and walked toward the intricately carved bronze mirror resting on the vanity. The reflection staring back at me was a stranger. She had soft, gentle eyes, plump, youthful cheeks, the face of a sheltered, arrogant noblewoman who believed her beauty and her family's name would protect her forever. I hated her. I reached out and picked up a heavy silver binyo, a traditional hairpin with a sharp, pointed end used to secure a braided chignon. I gripped it tightly in my right hand. Without breaking eye contact with my reflection, I pressed the sharp silver point into the palm of my left hand and pulled. The pain flared, hot and sharp, real, undeniable. A thick line of crimson blood welled up, dripping down my wrist and splashing onto my pristine white sleepwear. Court Lady Choi shrieked in horror behind me, scrambling to grab bandages, but I simply raised my bleeding hand and watched the crimson drops fall. This was no dream. I had drunk the poison. I had died, and the heavens, in their infinite, terrifying wisdom, had spat me back out. The naive, foolish Park Seo-yoon died on those wet cobblestones. The woman standing in front of the mirror now was a ghost with 3 years to burn an empire to the ground. Court Lady Choi wrapped my left hand in pristine white linen. She didn't ask why I had driven a silver hairpin into my own flesh. In the treacherous halls of the inner court, silence was a servant's greatest armor. I looked at my reflection again. The bleeding had stopped, but the pain remained, a grounding, beautiful reminder that I was alive. In my previous life, my greatest weakness had been my pride. Because I was the daughter of the northern commander, because my family's gold funded the royal treasury, I had walked through Gyeongbokgung Palace as if I already owned it. I was quick to anger, loud with my grievances, and deeply jealous. I had made it so incredibly easy for Consort Cho to paint me as a volatile, arrogant monster to the emperor and the court. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath of the morning air. Not this time, I thought. This time I will not be the storm. I will be the water that slowly drowns them. Choi, I said, my voice smooth, calm, and entirely unrecognizable to myself. Prepare the pale blue dongyi with the silver crane embroidery, and no heavy jade ornaments, just a simple pearl norige tassel. Choi blinked, startled. But, my lady, today is the morning greeting at the Dowager Empress's pavilion. You usually wear the crimson silk to outshine the other consorts. I do not wish to stand out, Choi, I replied softly. Today we become invisible. When I arrived at the grand pavilion of the Dowager Empress, the emperor's formidable mother, the other concubines stared at me in shock. I was usually the last to arrive, sweeping in with an entourage and a loud, demanding presence. Today, I was the first. I knelt on the polished wooden floor before the dowager's raised dais, bowing so low my forehead touched the woven mat. I stayed there, perfectly still, until the Dowager Empress finally emerged. She was a shrewd, sharp-eyed woman who had survived decades of palace bloodshed. In my past life, she had despised me for my arrogance. When the emperor moved to execute me, she had signed the decree without hesitation. Consort Park, she said, her voice laced with suspicion, as she looked down at my modest blue attire and lowered head. You are remarkably early and unusually quiet. Forgive my past foolishness, Your Highness, I spoke softly, keeping my eyes fixed respectfully on the hem of her robes. I had a dream last night that reminded me of my place. I am but a small leaf in the grand shadow of the imperial family. I brought you a gift, wild, century-old mountain ginseng from my father's northern province, to strengthen Your Highness for the coming spring. Choi presented the intricately carved wooden box. The dowager's eyes narrowed, searching for the trap, the hidden demand. But I asked for nothing. I simply bowed again, stepped back, and took my seat silently among the high-ranking consorts. When Consort Cho finally arrived, 20 minutes late, wearing a flashy, bright pink dress and giggling loudly, the Dowager Empress shot her a glare so venomous it could have withered a field of crops. The Dowager then looked back at my perfectly composed, serene face. The first seed of my protection had been planted. That evening, the Emperor came to my chambers. When Eunuch Song announced his arrival, my stomach violently rebelled. The memory of his cold eyes watching me drink the poison flashed behind my eyelids. My left hand throbbed where the cut was hidden beneath my long sleeves. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive my hairpin through his throat. Instead, I arranged my face into a mask of perfect, placid devotion. The doors slid open. Emperor Lee Yeon stepped inside. He wore casual, dark silk robes, smelling faintly of rice wine and the heavy musk of his perfume. In my past life, whenever he visited, I would immediately bombard him with complaints about Consort Cho, demanding more of his time, more of his affection. Tonight, I did not rush to him. I remained seated behind my geomungo, the large traditional zither resting on my lap. "Your Majesty," I murmured, bowing gracefully from my seated position. He paused, clearly bracing for an argument that never came. He frowned, stepping into the room and sitting on the cushions across from me. "You did not cause a scene at the Dowager's pavilion today. The court eunuchs are whispering that you have fallen ill." "I am perfectly well, Your Majesty," I said, a soft, polite smile touching my lips. "I merely realized that my petty grievances were a burden to the dragon of the nation. You carry the weight of Joseon. I should be a place of rest, not a source of noise." Lee Yeon stared at me. His dark eyes searched my face for sarcasm, for the fiery, jealous girl he knew. But he found nothing, only a calm, bottomless pool. "Play for me," he commanded softly, his voice betraying a hint of unease. I raised my right hand and began to play. The music filled the room, masking the deafening sound of my own hatred. As I plucked the heavy silk strings, I watched him from beneath my eyelashes. He closed his eyes, leaning back, genuinely relaxing for the first time in months. He thought he had tamed me. He thought the wild, powerful daughter of the North had finally broken and submitted to his absolute authority. Let him think it. A man who feels safe is a man who does not check his blind spots. And while he rested in the light of my submission, my mind was already descending into the dark. I poured his tea with perfect grace, and as he drank, I finalized the death warrant for his most trusted minister. The Shadow War began the very next morning. My first target was the royal treasury, more specifically the Minister of Finance, Lord Kim. Lord Kim was a brilliant, rat-faced man who managed the emperor's personal wealth. In my past life, it was Kim who meticulously forged the treasonous letters bearing my father's seal. It was Kim who had systematically drained the northern garrison's supplies, leaving my father's men vulnerable to foreign raids. Kim was a genius with numbers, but he had a fatal flaw, a flaw I only learned about in the dungeons of my previous life. I sat at my mahogany desk and ground my ink. I wrote a single encrypted letter using a childhood cipher only my older brother, Park Jin-woo, would understand. I hid the tiny scroll inside a hollowed-out chestnut, placing it into a basket of rejected kitchen scraps destined to be hauled out of the palace gates by our clan's undercover servants. My orders to my brother were absolute. Take 10 chests of our family's silver to Hanyang's underground district, find the Red Lantern Gisang house, buy the establishment outright, seize the debt ledgers. Minister Kim, the great financial mind of Joseon, was a degenerate gambling addict, and the Red Lantern was his favored den. It took exactly 3 days. On the 4th night, a plain, unmarked wooden box was delivered to Minister Kim's private quarters deep within the ministry compound. When the minister opened it, he found no gold, no threats of physical violence. Instead, sitting on a bed of black velvet was an exact, meticulously copied ledger of his illegal gambling debts. Debts so massive they eclipsed the annual tax revenue of 2 entire provinces. Next to the ledger was irrefutable proof that he had been secretly siphoning from the emperor's military funds to cover his losses. If the emperor saw this, Kim wouldn't just be executed, his entire bloodline would be wiped from history. Resting on top of the ledger was a single, freshly cut black lotus flower. Attached to its stem was a small strip of silk bearing a message written in elegant feminine calligraphy. Your life, your debts, and your breath now belong to the shadows. Speak of this to no one. Await my command, or the Emperor receives the original. Back in my chambers, I stood by the open window, looking out over the sprawling roofs of the palace under the moonlight. I held the matching black lotus in my unbandaged hand, slowly crushing the delicate petals between my fingers. The Emperor thought he controlled the court, but with one letter I had just stolen the master of his treasury. The first string of Lee Yeon's puppet show was cleanly severed and tied directly to my own fingers, and he hadn't felt anything. Spring arrived in Hanyang, painting the sprawling gardens of Gyeongbokgung Palace in vibrant hues of pink and white. The annual Spring Garden Party was the crown jewel of the season, a time when the inner court gathered beneath the blooming cherry blossoms to drink sweet rice wine and compose poetry. In my previous life, I had loved this festival. I had worn my finest silks and demanded the Emperor's attention at every turn, completely blind to the traps being laid at my feet. This time, I walked through the gardens like a ghost observing the living. I wore a subdued but elegant pale blue dangui, blending seamlessly with the serene atmosphere. I sat quietly among the high-ranking consorts, sipping my tea and offering polite, empty smiles to anyone who met my gaze. Consort Cho, on the other hand, was unraveling. For weeks, she had tried to bait me. She had her servants intentionally spill hot broth on my maids. She had openly mocked my family's northern heritage in front of the Dowager Empress. She had even paraded the Emperor's gifts in front of my pavilion, laughing loudly enough for the sound to carry through my paper doors. But I had given her nothing. No anger, no tears, no jealous outbursts. My absolute serenity was driving her mad. She needed a monster to fight, and I was refusing to grow claws in the light. So she decided to force my hand. The afternoon sun hung heavy over the grand lotus pond at the edge of the royal gardens. The pond was deep, freezing cold from the mountain runoff, and choked with thick green lily pads. The Emperor and his royal entourage were scheduled to pass by the pond on their way to the archery range. I saw Consort Cho watching the pathway, timing their approach. When she saw the golden royal pelican cresting the distant hill, she made her move. She dismissed her servants with a harsh whisper and walked to the very edge of the stone embankment, standing perilously close to the dark water. She looked back at me, her eyes flashing with a venomous, triumphant glint. "Consort Park," she called out, her voice loud enough to echo across the garden. "Come here, look at these magnificent koi." I knew exactly what she was about to do. I had lived this exact moment before. In my past life, I had foolishly walked over to her. The moment I was within arm's reach, she had screamed, thrown herself backward into the freezing water, and thrashed about, crying that I had pushed her out of petty jealousy. The Emperor had arrived just in time to see me standing over her drowning form, my hands outstretched in shock. He had struck me across the face that day, right in front of the entire court, after which he had punished me. All these he had done without bothering to hear me out. I stood up from my seat, smoothing the silk of my skirt. I walked toward her, my face a mask of polite curiosity. "They are lovely, Consort Cho," I murmured. I stopped exactly 2 paces away from her. The heavy thud of the royal guard's boots could now be heard approaching the garden entrance. The Emperor was seconds away. Cho smirked. She opened her mouth, let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream, and threw her weight backward off the stone ledge. She hit the freezing water with a violent splash, immediately sinking beneath the lily pads. She surfaced a second later, violently thrashing and screaming, "Help! She pushed me! Consort Park is trying to drown me!" I didn't freeze. I didn't gasp. The moment her body left the stone, my mind went completely cold. I looked down at her flailing form in the dock water. I heard the Emperor shout my name in alarm from the garden entrance. Without a single second of hesitation, I grabbed the heavy, restrictive silk of my skirts and threw myself head first into the freezing pond right after her. The shock of the cold was agonizing. The water closed over my head, icy and suffocating. I kicked hard, surfacing right next to Cho. She was genuinely panicking now, weighted down by her own heavy, ornate robes. When she saw me surface beside her, her eyes widened in absolute shock. "What are you?" she choked out, swallowing a mouthful of dirty pond water. "Let go of me, you lunatic!" I didn't let go. I wrapped my arms tightly around her waist, acting exactly like a desperate woman trying to save a drowning victim. Beneath the surface, away from the eyes of the court, I dug my nails fiercely into her ribs, forcing her to thrash even more violently. "Hold on, Consort Cho!" I screamed, making my voice crack with absolute terror. "I have you! Don't panic!" She clawed at my face, trying to push me away, realizing with dawning horror that I was hijacking her own trap. Every time she tried to push me under to save herself, it only made me look more heroic, more desperate to keep her afloat. "Stop!" she hissed, spitting water. "I can swim, you fool!" "Help us!" I wailed loudly, ignoring her completely, looking toward the shore with wide, desperate eyes. "She slipped! She's pulling us down!" Strong hands grabbed my shoulders. The royal guards had plunged into the water. They hauled us both up onto the muddy embankment. I collapsed onto the wet grass, shivering violently, gasping for air. I coughed up a mouthful of pond water, curling into a tight, miserable ball. I looked up. Emperor Lee Yeon was standing over me. His chest was heaving, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer disbelief. He looked at Consort Cho, who was sprawling on the grass, coughing and glaring at me with a hatred so pure it practically burned the air. "What happened here?" the Emperor demanded, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the garden. "She pushed me, Your Majesty," Sho shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "I was looking at the koi and she shoved me from behind." I didn't defend myself. I didn't say a word. I just knelt there, shivering violently in my ruined blue silks, looking up at the Emperor with traumatized eyes. The Dowager Empress stepped through the crowd of shocked courtiers. She looked at the distance between where I had been sitting and the edge of the pond. She looked at Cho's dry, untouched back, and then at my completely soaked, mud-stained figure. "You claim she pushed you, Consort Cho?" the Dowager asked, her voice like cracking ice. "And yet she threw herself into freezing water, risking her own life to pull you out?" She did it to cover her crime," Sho shrieked, realizing how absurd her story sounded to the outside world. The Emperor stepped forward. He didn't look at Cho. He looked entirely at me. He unfastened his heavy, fur-lined royal cloak and knelt in the mud. He wrapped the warm fabric securely around my trembling shoulders. "You leaped in after her," he murmured, his voice softening in a way I hadn't heard in years. "You could have drowned, Seo-yoon." I lowered my head submissively, letting a single, perfectly timed tear slip down my freezing cheek. "I could not stand by and watch a member of Your Majesty's family perish, even if she is confused about how she fell." The Emperor's jaw tightened. He stood up and turned to Consort Cho. The look he gave her was one of profound disappointment. You have caused a massive scene, Consort Cho, and endangered the life of a higher-ranking consort with your clumsiness and your false accusations," the Dowager Empress declared coldly, stepping in before the Emperor could speak. "You will confine yourself to your quarters for 2 months, and you will copy the sutras of repentance until your fingers bleed." Sho's face drained of all color. She opened her mouth to argue, but the Emperor turned his back on her, offering his hand to help me stand. As he escorted me away from the pond, the heavy weight of his royal cloak shielding me from the cold wind, I let my head rest gently against his shoulder. I looked back just once over his arm. Sho was still kneeling in the mud, humiliated, defeated, and completely outplayed. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, a gloating look in my eyes. First blood goes to me. 2 years passed like a slow-burning stick of incense. In the eyes of the court, I had become the untouchable jewel of Gyeongbokgung Palace, the most favored consort. The Emperor visited my pavilion more than any other, seeking the quiet, obedient sanctuary I had so carefully crafted for him. Consort Sho, having ruined her own reputation in the lotus pond, was a ghost in her own quarters. Her influence had withered, replaced by the suffocating reality that she had been utterly outmaneuvered. But I took no joy in my elevated status. Every time the Emperor touched my hand, every time he praised my gentle nature, the phantom taste of the sanyak poison burned in the back of my throat. I was not there to be his beloved consort. I was a parasite, quietly draining the lifeblood of his empire. The first phase of my shadow war was bleeding his treasury dry. Deep in the underground district of Hanyang, hidden behind the silk curtains and sweet plum wine of the Red Lantern Gisang House, the true power of the nation was shifting. Minister Kim, the Emperor's brilliant but deeply compromised Minister of Finance, now answered exclusively to the Black Lotus. Through my brother, Park Jin-woo, who managed my underground network disguised as a wealthy silk merchant, I issued my commands to the trembling minister. The orders were audacious, yet mathematically invisible. Kim was to alter the imperial ledgers fraction by fraction. The massive shipments of silver ingots meant to supply the Emperor's capital defense forces were quietly rerouted. Instead of arming the men who guarded Lee Yeon's throne, the silver was packed into hidden compartments beneath wagons of heavy northern silk and shipped directly to Pyongyang province. To my father, to the impenetrable northern garrison. Over 24 months, while the Emperor hosted lavish poetry banquets and commissioned new pleasure gardens, I systematically bought the loyalty of 70,000 northern soldiers using his own stolen gold. If he ever ordered his army to march on my family again, he would find their swords entirely paid for by his own severed purse strings. But gold alone was not enough to dethrone a sitting emperor. I needed something that would destroy his absolute right to rule. I needed to shatter the mandate of heaven. The opportunity arrived on the eve of the winter solstice. The Emperor had come to my chambers late in the night, looking visibly exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed a deep, gnawing paranoia. His capital guards were complaining of delayed wages, and his inner circle of corrupt ministers was growing restless. The invisible noose I had tied around his treasury was finally beginning to choke him. He lay his head on my lap while I gently brushed his hair, staring blankly at the ceiling. "The throne is a heavy chair, Seo-yoon," he murmured, his voice laced with a bitter fatigue. "There are wolves in the northern mountains who believe they can extort the dragon. They forget who wears the crown." He fell asleep there, trusting me implicitly.
but the moment his breathing deepened, I noticed a crumpled piece of rough, unbleached parchment protruding from the inner fold of his dark silk robe. It was not imperial parchment. It looked coarse, like the paper used by barbarian traders beyond the Yalu River. With agonizing slowness, my hands steady as stone, I slipped the parchment from his robes. I unrolled it near the dim light of the oil lamp. The message was written in crude, broken Hanja, but the meaning hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was a blackmail demand from a tribe of Jurchen mercenaries. They were demanding an exorbitant sum of silver to be delivered to the border before the first snowfall. If the Emperor failed to pay, they threatened to reveal what he had given them 5 years ago to fund the bloody coup that won him the throne. They threatened to reveal the Oksei, the Imperial Jade Seal. My blood ran cold. The Oksei was the soul of Joseon, carved from a single block of flawless green jade, topped with a coiled dragon. It was the only artifact that legitimized imperial decrees. Without it, a man was not an emperor. He was just a warlord sitting in a large house. For years, the court had whispered that the emperor rarely stamped documents himself, delegating the task to eunuch Song behind closed screens. The realization was staggering. Lee Yeon had pawned the very soul of the nation to foreign killers to buy his crown. He had been ruling with a forged seal for half a decade. If the court knew this, if the scholars and generals saw proof that he had surrendered the mandate of heaven to barbarians, his reign would end by sunset. It wouldn't just be a rebellion, it would be a holy purge. I carefully slipped the parchment back into his robes, exactly as I had found it.
Before dawn broke, I smuggled an emergency missive to my brother. The cipher was written in my own blood to convey the absolute urgency of the task. Jinwoo, take the Black Riders, cross the Yalu River into the frozen wastes, find the Jurchen warlord, buy it, steal it, or pry it from his dead hands, but you must bring me the dragon. The next 4 months were the longest of my 2 lives. Winter descended on Hanyang like a suffocating blanket. The palace was buried beneath layers of pristine white snow, beautiful and dead. I played my part flawlessly, attending the Dowager Empress, pouring tea for the increasingly manic emperor, and watching Consort Cho slowly rot in her isolation. But every night I stared out at the northern horizon, praying to whatever dark gods had sent me back in time to keep my brother alive. If Jinwoo failed, if he was caught by the Emperor's spies or slaughtered by the Jurchens, my entire shadow court would collapse. Then came the night of the spring thaw. A violent thunderstorm had rolled over the capital, masking the sounds of the palace. I was alone in my chambers, reading by candlelight, when the heavy paper doors slid open with a sharp crack. A man stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, his dark traveling cloak dripping rainwater onto the polished wooden floor. He pulled back his hood. It was Jinwoo. He looked 10 years older. His face was weathered by the biting northern winds, and a fresh, jagged scar ran down the side of his neck. He was breathing heavily, his eyes burning with a fierce, wild exhaustion. He didn't speak. He simply stepped into the room, reached under his heavy cloak, and pulled out a square box made of dark, heavy ironwood. He set it on my low mahogany table. The thud it made was impossibly heavy. My hands trembled as I reached out and undid the iron latch. I opened the lid. Resting on a bed of faded, blood-stained velvet was the Oksei, the Imperial Jade Seal. The green stone caught the dim candlelight, glowing with an ancient, terrifying power. The intricately carved dragon resting on top seemed to watch me, judging my worth. I reached out and touched the cool, smooth jade. The power of an entire empire, the destiny of millions of lives rested right here on my table. I looked up at my brother. He gave me a single grim nod. "The Emperor is a beggar in silk," Jinwoo whispered, his voice raspy from months on the road. "The North is armed, the treasury is ours, and the mandate of heaven sits in your hands." I closed the ironwood box and carried it to the corner of my room. With a small iron pry bar, I lifted a loose floorboard beneath my sleeping mat, placing the box into the dark cavity beneath the palace. I replaced the board, smoothing the woven mat over the hidden tomb of the Emperor's reign. I stood up, the lightning outside flashing to illuminate my cold, tearless face. 3 years of playing the fool, 3 years of smiling at the man who murdered me. The waiting was finally over. The 3rd year of Emperor Lee Yeon's reign reached its zenith. It was the month of the tiger, the exact month, the exact week of my death in the previous timeline. The air in the capital was crisp and fragrant with blooming plum blossoms, but inside the towering walls of Gyeongbokgung Palace, the atmosphere was suffocating. The emperor had called for a massive royal banquet in the Gunjongjeon, the grandest throne hall in the empire, to celebrate his birthday and project an illusion of absolute power to his restless court. It was the very same banquet where 3 years ago his guards had stormed in, dragged me from my seat, and thrown my father's bloodied armor at my feet. As Court Lady Choi helped me dress that evening, her hands trembled slightly. The entire palace could feel the tension, a low electrical hum preceding a devastating storm. For 3 years, I had worn pale blues, soft pinks, and pure whites. I had been the gentle water, the submissive lotus. Not tonight. "The black silk, Choi," I commanded softly. She opened the heavy cedar chest and lifted the garments I had commissioned in absolute secrecy. It was a magnificent, sweeping dongi made of midnight black silk, intricately embroidered with silver threads depicting a rising phoenix. Black was not a color worn by concubines. It was the color of the deep abyss, the color of judgment. When I stepped into the blinding light of the throne hall, a hush fell over the hundreds of assembled ministers, generals, and nobles. I walked down the center aisle, my silver and black robes trailing behind me like a shadow. The emperor sat elevated on his golden throne, flanked by his royal banners. When he saw me, his eyes widened slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his arrogant features. He had expected his quiet, devoted sanctuary. He was looking at a stranger. I took my seat just below the dais. Across from me sat Consort Seo. She looked haggard, her beauty thinned by 2 years of isolation and irrelevance. Yet tonight there was a desperate, manic gleam in her eyes. She had spent the last of her family's bribing power to place a servant in my quarters. She believed a cursed talisman, a symbol of treasonous dark magic, was currently hidden beneath my sleeping mat. She was only waiting for the right moment to strike. "To the endless prosperity of Joseon!" Emperor Lee Yeon roared, raising a cup of clear rice wine. He forced a broad, confident smile, but I could see the slight tremor in his hand. The treasury was empty. The northern border was silent. He was a king standing on rotting floorboards. "To the emperor!" the court echoed, a sea of red, blue, and green robes bowing in unison. As they drank, Consort Seo abruptly stood up. Her voice, shrill and grating, cut through the celebratory music. "Your Majesty!" she cried out, dropping to her knees at the base of the stairs. "I beg for your justice. A darkness has infiltrated this court. Consort Park is practicing black sorcery to curse your royal lineage." Gasps rippled through the hall. The music died instantly. The emperor slammed his cup down, his face darkening with rage, not at her accusation, but at the public embarrassment she was causing him yet again. "Consort Seo, you overstep," he warned, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Search her chambers!" Seo shrieked, pointing a trembling, triumphant finger at me. "I swear it on my life. Search beneath her mat, and you will find the dark talisman. She is a witch." The Emperor looked at me. I did not defend myself. I did not even blink. I simply took a slow, elegant sip of my tea. Before the Emperor could issue a command to his guards, the side doors of the hall slid open. Court Lady Choi walked in, her steps measured and calm. She carried a silver tray. Resting on it was a hideous wooden effigy bound in red twine, the cursed talisman. Seo let out a breathless, victorious laugh. "You see, I told you, the witch's servant brings her own doom." Court Lady Choi stopped before the throne, bowing deeply. "Your Majesty, while sweeping the quarters this evening, we did indeed discover this treasonous object." She paused, her eyes shifting to the kneeling, manic woman. "We found it nailed beneath the bed frame of Consort Cho." Sho's laughter died in her throat. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a corpse. "No, no, that is impossible. I paid the servant to put it in her room. It's a lie." In her panic, she had just confessed to orchestrating the entire plot in front of the entire imperial court. The Emperor closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose in utter disgust. "Guards, remove this wretched woman from my sight, strip her of her titles and throw her in the deepest cell of the tribunal." "No, Lee Yeon, please, she is tricking you!" Cho screamed, clawing at the wooden floor as the royal guards grabbed her arms and dragged her kicking and sobbing from the grand hall. Her screams faded into the night, a pathetic end to the woman who had once stood over me and smiled while I drank poison. The hall was deathly silent. The Emperor cleared his throat, trying to salvage the shattered dignity of his banquet. "Let us put this ugliness behind us. Minister Kim, pour the wine. Let the music resume." Nobody moved. Minister Kim, the master of the royal treasury, did not step forward to pour the wine. He stood completely still, staring blankly ahead. "Minister Kim," the Emperor snapped, his voice rising in panic. "I gave you an order." I slowly placed my teacup down on the wooden table. The sound it made was no louder than a falling leaf, yet in the silent hall, it felt like the strike of a hammer. The massive, heavy ironwood doors at the entrance of the Gunjeongjian did not just open, they were violently kicked apart. The heavy, terrifying sound of iron-shod boots hitting stone echoed through the cavernous room. 300 heavily armored soldiers marched into the hall in perfect, terrifying unison. They wore the thick, black iron scale armor of the northern garrison, my father's men. Their swords were drawn, the polished steel gleaming under the ceremonial lanterns. The Empire erupted in panicked screams. Ministers scrambled backward, overturning tables and spilling wine. Emperor Lee Yeon leaped from his golden throne, his face twisted in absolute fury and terror. "Treason!" he bellowed, his voice cracking. "Capital defense! Royal guards! Strike these northern traitors down!" The captain of the royal guards drew his blade, but he did not point it at the northern soldiers. He turned slowly and leveled his sword directly at the Emperor's chest. "What is the meaning of this?" Lee Yeon screamed, spit flying from his lips, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "Minister Kim, summon the reserve garrisons, issue the royal mandate." Minister Kim stepped out from the trembling crowd of nobles. He walked to the center of the room. He did not look at the Emperor. He turned toward me, sank to his knees and pressed his forehead to the floor in a deep, absolute bow. Slowly, like a collapsing wave, the rest of the court followed. The Minister of War knelt, the chief scholar knelt. One by one, the red, blue, and green robes dropped to the floor. 2/3 of the entire imperial court bowed their heads not to the dragon on the throne, but to the woman in black silk sitting quietly below it. Lee Yeon stumbled backward, his legs hitting the base of his throne. He looked at his kneeling ministers, his rebelling guards, and finally his eyes locked onto mine. The illusion of his power shattered, leaving only a small, terrified man staring at the architect of his ruin. I stood up. The silk of my dress whispered against the floorboards. I walked up the granite steps, ascending the dais until I was standing right in front of him. "Seo-yoon," he breathed, his voice a pathetic, trembling rasp. "What have you done?" "I am merely balancing the scales, Your Majesty," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the kneeling court. I reached into the wide sleeve of my dangyu and pulled out the heavy ironwood box my brother had brought from the frozen north. I undid the latch and pulled out the oksei, the true Imperial Jade Seal. As I held the glowing green jade high above my head, a collective gasp swept through the remaining loyalists in the room. "The Emperor is a fraud," my voice rang out, cold and absolute, striking every corner of the vast hall. 5 years ago, Lee Yeon pawned the soul of Joseon to Jurchen mercenaries to buy the swords that won him this throne. He has ruled with a forged seal, bleeding this nation dry to cover his own treason. The mandate of heaven does not belong to him. Lee Yeon's knees gave out. He collapsed onto the steps, his royal crown slipping off his head and clattering loudly down the stone stairs. He looked exactly as I had 3 years ago, broken, betrayed, completely stripped of everything he loved. "You planned this," he whispered, staring up at me with wide, horrified eyes. "From the beginning, you planned this?" I leaned down, my face inches from his, ensuring only he could hear my final words. "You gave me the taste of black snow, Lee Yeon. I told you I would return to burn your empire to the ground. Did you think I was lying?" I straightened my back and looked out over the sea of kneeling men and drawn swords. "Commander," I called to the captain of the guards, "arrest the traitor Lee Yeon. Strip him of his imperial robes." The guards seized him roughly, hauling him to his feet. He didn't fight. The fight had been completely drained from him. "And, Commander," I added, my voice devoid of any mercy, "prepare a bowl of sanyak. He has a taste for poison, and it is time he choked on it." As they dragged him screaming and thrashing from the throne room, his cries echoing down the same stone corridors where I had once been dragged, I didn't watch him go. I turned and walked out onto the grand balcony of the Gunjeongjeon. The rain had started to fall again, washing over the palace roofs, but this time it didn't feel like ice. I took a deep, slow breath. The air smelled of wet earth, blooming plum blossoms, and absolute, undeniable freedom. The empire had fallen, and I didn't even need to wear the crown to rule it.
The rain returned to Hanyang exactly 3 days after the banquet. It fell over the sprawling roofs of Gyeongbokgung Palace in thick, heavy sheets, washing away the remnants of the spring festival. I stood on the elevated wooden balcony of the Gunjeongjeon, shielded by the grand painted eaves, looking down at the main courtyard. It was the exact spot where Emperor Lee Yeon had stood 3 years ago, watching me die. Now, our positions were reversed. Down in the mud and the freezing rain, Lee Yeon knelt. He had been stripped of his royal dragon robes. He wore only thin, rough, white undergarments, soaking wet and clinging to his shivering frame. His hair, once impeccably tied beneath his royal crown, hung in loose, matted strands across his face. Before him stood Chief Eunuch Song. The eunuch held the same lacquered wooden tray, the same yellow silk cloth, and the same celadon bowl filled with sonyak, the royal poison. Lee Yeon did not face his death with dignity. When Eunuch Song read the decree of high treason, the deposed emperor openly wept. He thrashed against the northern guards holding him down, screaming my name, begging for an audience, begging for mercy. He sounded like a frightened child. I felt nothing, no surge of triumph, no lingering hatred. Watching him break was simply the final stroke of a brush on a long, exhausting painting.
Eunuch Song, terrified of the new power in the palace and desperate to prove his loyalty to me, did not wait for Lee Yeon to accept his fate. At a sharp nod from the northern garrison captain, 2 guards forced Lee Yeon's jaw open, and Eunuch Song poured the black liquid down his throat. The deposed emperor collapsed onto the wet cobblestones, violently convulsing as the bitter poison burned through his veins. I watched until he took his final, agonizing breath. Then I turned my back on the courtyard and walked inside. The debt was paid in full. My next task lay in the quiet, incense-heavy pavilion of the Dowager Empress. When I slid the paper doors open, she was already waiting for me. She was a woman who had survived decades of palace bloodshed. She knew how the game ended. She did not scream like Consort Cho. She did not weep like her son. She sat perfectly straight at her low table, sipping jasmine tea. "Consort Park," she said evenly, not bothering to look up. "Or should I say, the new master of the board?" I sat across from her. "Lee Yeon is dead. The northern garrison holds the gates. The treasury is secured. The court has surrendered." The dowager finally looked at me. Her sharp, calculating eyes searched my face. She saw no hesitation. She realized with a chilling clarity that she had been completely outplayed for 3 long years. "You want my signature, a decree from the Dowager Empress denouncing my own son as a usurper, formally invalidating his reign." "It is the only way to prevent a fractured court," I replied smoothly. "You will sign the decree. In exchange, you will not join your son in the courtyard. You will be escorted to the White Lotus Temple high in the Suraksan Mountains. You will live out the rest of your days in absolute luxury, surrounded by your loyal servants, but you will never step foot in the capital again." She looked down at her tea, a quiet surrender. She reached for her ink brush. As she signed the heavy parchment, sealing the death of her son's legacy, she paused. She looked up at me, the brush hovering over the paper. "When you threw yourself into that freezing pond to save Consort Cho, I thought you were a naive, foolish lotus. I did not realize you were the blade waiting beneath the water. May the heavens have mercy on whoever tries to cross you next." "The heavens have already had their turn with me, Your Highness," I said softly. "They know better now." With the old regime swept away, the throne sat empty, but not for long. The following morning, the full court was assembled in the imperial throne room. Rows of officials and ministers in their formal red, blue, and green court robes stood frozen in absolute stillness. They were men who had been told one thing their entire lives and are now seeing another. The heavy doors opened. Walking through the center of the massive hall toward the empty throne was the late emperor's exiled third prince. For 5 years, Lee Yeon had spread rumors that his half-brother was a crippled, broken man living in squalor, a narrative meant to kill any hope of a rebellion. But the man walking down the aisle used no cane. He was not in a wheeled chair. There was no performance of damage. He wore full imperial military dress, the heavy, commanding robes of a prince who knew exactly who he was. He walked with the settled, heavy authority of a man returning to a house that belonged to him. His expression was even, composed, and direct. Beside him walked my brother, carrying the true Imperial Jade Seal in the ironwood box. The third prince ascended the dais. He turned to face the terrified court. He didn't need to speak a single word. His presence alone shattered the last remnants of Lee Yeon's lies. The ministers fell to their knees once more, bowing to their true emperor. Later that evening, the new emperor summoned me to his private study. "The throne is secure," he said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. Your father's armies have pacified the border. The treasury is balancing. I owe you my crown, Seo-yoon. Name your reward. The seat of the Empress is yours if you desire it." I looked out the open window, toward the dark, sprawling pavilions of the inner court, the place where women were trapped like gilded birds, fighting to the death over a man's fleeting attention. I had died in that cage once. I would not walk back into it. "I decline, Your Majesty," I said respectfully. "I have no desire to be the mother of the nation. I will not live in the inner court." The emperor looked surprised, but he nodded slowly, understanding the depth of the scars the palace had left on me. "Then what will you do?" "My father will remain commander of the north. My brother will officially become your minister of finance," I stated. "As for me, I wish to remain in the shadows, but this time by choice." And so, history was quietly rewritten. I stepped out of the royal harem entirely. The new emperor created an unprecedented title for me, Grand Inspector of the Realm. I was given my own estate just outside the palace walls, a sprawling compound heavily guarded by men entirely loyal to my family. I wore no bright silks. I attended no poetry banquets. I wore my black and silver dangui, holding court in the quiet hours of the night. The new emperor wore the crown, and he ruled justly, but every minister, every general, and every noble in Hanyang knew the truth. Not a single piece of silver moved in the treasury, not a single law was passed, and not a single blade was drawn in Joseon without the silent, unwavering approval of the woman who had returned from the dead. I had promised to burn the corrupt empire to the ground, and from its ashes I had built a new one, this time with my hands firmly on the reins.